So Arsen Otrowski was the gentleman that turned up in the. He was one of the victims at the Bondi shooting from the day before yesterday, uh, and he's taking a selfie of himself after he's been grazed by a bullet. And I went, "Oh yeah, okay, cool. People do strange things when they're injured, and thought that's but strange taking a selfie, but never mind." And then his name came up that he was actually, I had been warning about this attack beforehand. And this is again, the attack is carried out by two members of two immigrants to Australia who, the Narevs, who at this stage we know one of them had a gun license, one of them was on a watch list. For 20 minutes, basically, there were police in the area. There was a police station 250 yards away from where the attack occurred, the Bondi police station. I know the area quite well. Um, and this group of basically Islamic people decided to turn around and attack this group of Jewish people at this festival. And we actually would expect some reasonably prominent Israelis to be at this event because, just explain, like Bondi's got very strong Israeli Jewish expat community, and they're quite often down there. It's nothing unusual. But when I started looking at this guy's profile, I said again, like the 20 minutes, nothing happened. 19 to give you a comparison, in the Christchurch shooting, they had him banged to rights within 19 minutes. I think it was actually 12, about under, it was it might have been 17 minutes, but basically they still had this guy, the Burnton Durant, within 20 minutes. These guys, the police sat back and did absolutely nothing for 20 minutes before they even got into action, which is kind of amazing. And of course, they were disarmed by, I don't know the gentleman's name, but he is also an Arabic nature, so good kudos to him. And that's a really good way to defang all the anti-Islamophobes out there. And you could have done a more better bit of work out there, because this is about stupid people who seem to think that their God is better than others on both sides, carrying on this perpetual cycle of violence. But this guy Arsen Ostrowski was like, I was looking and going, that name's really interesting. And it turned out that Arsen Ostrowski's father is Victor Ostrowski, who's a former Mossad agent. And I actually quote him in my book, State Secrets. And I'm quoting him here because in the chapter 23 of this book, The Other Side of Deception, which is the whole book is basically about spycraft and ways that Israeli intelligence actually manipulate public attention and world events to further the aims of this. Basically, of the the far right of Israel. I'm not going to say the Israel people because this is not their fault. This is a group of the military-industrial complex. The same problem we have in the West. But in chapter 23, it's very interesting because he talks about he constantly makes reference to basically a private airline which has been run by the Israeli intelligence service called, and when you look in the reference of this, and he's talking about a routine of weapons where basically the Israel intelligence is actually arming the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, Anton Sphere has also turned around and said this, and I said this in 1995 when I wrote the article A State of Terror, which was talking about the arms that were going into Bosnia, which included arms that were being routed for Australia, which is the kind of the aim of Victor Ostrowski's book and The Other Side of Deception. And in the case of the arms that were going into Bosnia, well, they were eventually used as excuse for NATO to begin bombing basically Eastern Europe. I always want to say Belarus, but it's not. It's part of basically former Yugoslavia, that kind of area there. And that kind of like led to the expansion of troops going into NATO, and then they expanded further eastwards. And eventually, what we ended up in a situation where the Russians were saying, no, we're not going to accept this. And then, well, here we actually are. But that original pipeline that was, feeding those, insurgents was actually connected to this arms network, which Viktor Ostrowski wrote about, and which I also wrote about, consistently in my first two books, State 1, Secrets 1, and State Secrets 2. It's basically this massive arms line that's been connected to companies that are operating out of New Zealand, Pacific Express, Bulgaria Air, which was the ones that were used to carry mercenaries to PNG, used in the Sandline affair. Later on, it was the big Russian Antonov that was found loaded with arms, basically in Thailand, that was going to head towards the Middle East. and that turned around and found this whole money laundering trail of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of money being laundered through Australian and New Zealand banks, ending up in New York banks, and that money was being used basically, money for the Russian cartel, money for the Mexican cartels, but again, also money for terrorist groups. And again, in my book, State Secrets 1 and 2, plus what I've been writing about consecutively, is about how the Food for Oil program, which New Zealand participated because we didn't want to miss out on construction rebuild, and we did it on behalf of a Vostok Immigration, which they're one of the guys that ran that, Ian Robinson, ran a bank in New Zealand called uh, Proc Bank, which was run in conjunction with Ross Morant, who was a former Writers' Centre and head of the Red Riot Squad, and they ran this bank called Proc Bank, which was again all by this Russian money being pumped through the Pacific Islands. And pretty much going back to the Food for Oil program was that the Food for Oil program, which was basically a way that the Americans who were plundering Russia were using to basically pay backhanders to the people that were helping them doing that, including what they thought Putin, and then Putin turned around and said, no, 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 I'm not, thanks for the money, but now show us your textbooks. Oh, no, no, you haven't paid your tax, piss off. And those guys in the States went to jail, and a lot of those guys set up in New Zealand, and again, a lot of this was Russian-Israeli connections. All these guys had multiple Russian passports, and again, a lot of these, the guys that we talk about, the Israelis that were running out of, linked to the attack on Zekmabin, the 9/11 attack terrorists. They were a specific group of Russians that were kind of like a sidelight off the Shin Bet, and they kind of like had this Russian-Israeli overlap. Just to mean all side, I'm not making a big deal, just explaining out the profile. But so this is interesting that his son is actually one of the victims, and his father turned around and spent his life saying, well, actually, Israel are dodgy as fuck. They're using Islamic organisations to carry out attacks, or like what I also wrote about was in the Lint attack, was that one of the tricks that ASIO were doing was that they were picking people from immigration camps that might have either mental health issues or were criminally dodgy, and then applying leverage to these people to basically say, well, you need to spy on us, or cause some incidences, and then we'll go easy on you, or more likely we'll go easy on your family. We'll go hard on you, but we'll go easy on your family. And they were using this to kind of like trigger this whole, and this goes all the way back to ASIO, when basically Whitlam tried to shut down ASIO because he's going, well, I think you've got some dodgy, you're doing up to some dodgy things, and this specifically was the idea that ASIO may have been arming far-right extremists from the Croatians back in the 1970s that carried out a bombing in the Helton bombing. And then we fast forward to the events in Ukraine where there were like Australian mercenaries turning up to fight in the Ukraine, many having overlaps with Brent and Tarrant. And again, the red alarm was going, is ASIO going back to the dirty old tricks? And again, I'm not saying this is the case in this event. I'm just giving you background profile history because of who this guy's father is. It's really, really, really interesting about, of all the people, that could be involved. This guy has this direct link to Viktor Trotsky, who's like kind of spilled the beans on these are all the things that basically Mossad will do to wield people's public opinion. At the end of the day, I am quite happy to believe that it could be the people behind this were actually Hamas or Muslim Brotherhood. I don't know. It's been less than 48 hours. Nobody actually has done. You can't do an investigation thoroughly, know what's happening. And if you're trying to do so, it's because you're trying to force an agenda. So I'm not saying, but what I'm trying to get across is that okay, if it's Hamas or it's the Muslim Brotherhood or it's the Mossad, it's just the whole convoluted that whole world of terrorism. It's so hideous because it's always travels back to this, and it's always that the people, the foot soldiers on the ground, are actually being pushed towards that direction by somebody above them, because it's a never-ending war that always goes the further. You think you've got it covered, and you peel it back, and there's another layer behind it, but it always comes back to making this. And unfortunately, what happens is on the ground street, the people at the bottom start to fear those people. We fear those people. We start to hate those people. We become that much more easy to manipulate. When reality is, we always need to look up. It's not left wing, right wing. It's not Islam. It's not Jewish. It's the money trail. Follow the money trail, because that'll solve you at the end of the day. As what Viktor Trotsky himself had said, at the end of the day, this is all just a billy game, and you've got all these guys in Africa, you've got Arab guys and Islamic guys that are working together just to exploit the shit out of the gold. Like in Dubai, which is, corruption city, 90% of the gold that comes out of Africa is stolen, and it goes to Dubai. And that same money is used to basically run the drug trade in both Australia and the United Kingdom. So the links between the organised crime and uh, fundamentalism are a lot closer than you think, because it's actually about transnational crime. The world's become a much more complicated place, and so my attitude, my general advice to everyone is, before you have a hard, fast view on anything, gather up all the information. Find out who was that person related to who, what connections did they have, how come that person had a license, why did ASIO, why did the police take 20 minutes to actually action, why was this guy on a watch list, but yet they still managed to have guns, and it doesn't make these are all the things. These are all these very, very complicated situations. Of course, while I was in Australia last year, I became very clear to me that while there was lots of people out there being encouraged to follow the Free Palestine movement, which again is explained to you when I've been to Mexico and seen how the existing government, which the people who are not happy with, is convincing its people to go around, spray out, wipe out all the signs talking about how the military basically massacred their own people, and thus spraying Free Palestine. And so the people that are behind the Free Palestine, they have good intentions, but they don't realise that there's actually quite big money behind this. But it's also true. It's also true of what I'm saying on the other side. And this is why it's so frustrating, because what is in Australia, and there was all this Free Palestine, lots of advertising, being used by both sides. I've seen it happen here in New Zealand. Both sides have been using Free Palestine to score points, and they've even been mock Free Palestine people to make. It's just crazy. But at the same time, what wasn't being exposed was the massive arms sales that were going on. Where Australia was selling weapons where Israel, again, some of these people on the side where Israeli people were making big money out of it. And I've seen Russian Antonovs turn up in Canberra doing little checks, and yep, sure enough, these guys were on the arms deal, driving into Bendigo, finding a big, huge factory, massive amounts of our weapons, as far as I can be seen, all destined to the war in the Ukraine, so we can have more war, which creates more debt, which means that the people at the bottom get crushed further, and the people at the top make more of this. You getting it yet?